Can you rewire your brain? And if you can, how do you do it? And should you do it? I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and in this video, we're going to be exploring the incredible science of neuroplasticity that shows us how we can and how we should attempt to rewire our brains for better brain function and better brain health. If you're new here, I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. I'm a board-certified internal medicine doctor. I'm a neuroscience researcher, and I am here to give you life-transforming information that changes how you think, how you act, and how you feel by leveraging the best of recent brain science or neuroscience. Today, we're diving into the groundbreaking science of applied neuroplasticity. And if you love learning about how to improve your brain and how to improve your health by improving your brain, be sure to click subscribe. Quick disclaimer before we get started, this is purely for educational purposes, not for medical advice. With all that said, let's jump right in. To begin, let's talk about the basics of brain rewiring. Now, this is one of the fundamental points to understand about neuroscience, which is that every day with each moment, our brains are actively changing. This is incredible. This is an insane amount of opportunity because it means that we change, our brains change with each passing moment. But it is also an incredible risk because it means that that change can happen for our benefit or it can happen in a way that actually decreases our quality of life. So the question we need to be asking ourselves is, how do we harness the potential of brain change, of rewiring our brains so it is for our benefit rather than watching while our brains change for the worse? In this video, we'll be talking about the science of rewiring the brain and the powerful and practical steps we can take each day to ensure that it goes in your favor. I'll be telling you about how you can harness this science to reprogram your brain for better memory, for better mental health, for better focus, and for better general cognition. And we'll talk about some of the best studied strategies that you can use to make this happen today. Now, as a basic overview, if you're looking to just find out what you can do to improve your brain function through neuroplasticity, I will be talking about that at the end of this video. But I want to explore a little bit of the background as it relates to how neuroplasticity works, because I believe that by understanding how our brains function, we all become a little bit more curious and motivated to apply this science. So it's not just about saying, well, this is a strategy that will help you to rewire your brain for the better. We've got to find out how that happens. And I think that if you're here and you're interested in the brain, this is going to prove especially compelling. This idea that the human brain changes across the lifespan is one of the most powerful ideas in all of neuroscience, and it counters hundreds of years of belief that the brain is relatively fixed, especially in adulthood. When we talk about this in a scientific perspective, brain rewiring is called neuroplasticity. And the basic idea is to understand the strength and the number of connections between our brain cells is dynamic and is altered by our interactions with the world around us. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Neuroplasticity can rapidly become a complicated thing to get our heads around. We're primarily going to be talking about this synaptic plasticity, the idea of changing the number and strength of the connections, aka synapses, between our neurons. Again, the basic idea here is that these things change as a function of what happens around us and within us. Brain rewiring can be observed at the level of individual brain cells. It can also be seen as it reflects in structural changes in the brain and in network changes and activation patterns that can be visualized across large areas of the brain. As it relates to the actual mechanisms of neuroplasticity, like I said, this is complicated and there are a number of different pathways involved. When we look at molecular and cellular pathways that are involved in neuroplasticity, the general theme here is that the activity of brain cells changes the strength and the number of connections between brain cells. This is famously described by Donald Hebb, who is a psychologist who proposed that brain cells that, quote, fire together, wire together. One of the key biological pathways undergirding neuroplasticity speaks to the number and strength of connections between neurons. And again, these connections are called synapses. Neuroplasticity changes the formation of new synapses by biasing them towards more synapses or potentially less synapses between neurons. So it can remove or add synapses, and it can strengthen or weaken the strength of those connections. These changes are undergirded by processes like long-term potentiation and long-term depression, as well as receptors like the AMPA receptor and NMDA receptor, and these in turn relate to levels of neurotransmitters like glutamate. What I would say is that in addition to neurons, which make up around 80 billion of the cells in our brain, glial cells, which make up around another 80 billion cells in our brain, are also involved in neuroplasticity. There are additional correlates of neuroplasticity, and one of the most notable is something called neurogenesis, which is the formation of new neurons, as well as changes in the length and the branches of neuronal dendrites. There are functional changes in how the brain works. There are changes that can be seen in the context of something like brain injury, where parts of the brain can actually take up slack and start doing things that they didn't usually do. These are all forms of neuroplasticity. And if you're interested to learn more about all this complicated science, but really fascinating science about the different forms of neuroplasticity in the brain, let me know in the comments and I'll do a deep dive video and commentary on the various forms of neuroplasticity. With this said, what I would focus on for the purposes of today's conversation is that the way that we experience our lives and the experiences that we have both outside of us and within us as it relates to cell experiences change the way that our neurons are wired, and that this change in this wiring, primarily we're going to be focusing on the synapses today, but relates to human health outcomes. So what are some of those human health outcomes that relate to neuroplasticity within the brain? As we look at the research on this topic, the combination of neuroplasticity, human brain diseases, human brain function, as I mentioned, in the context of something like a stroke, a brain injury, neuroplasticity is thought to be a key contributor to how people regain function of their brains, and how different parts of the brain that maybe weren't tasked with one thing can do some compensatory action and can help to make up some of the deficit. So in the context of, again, a stroke or other brain injury, neuroplasticity can help to recover lost brain function. In addition, there's been a lot of conversation about neuroplasticity linked to things like meditation, as well as neuroplasticity linked to other activities, which we'll get into later on when we talk about practical ways to apply neuroplasticity today. But the core idea here is that when we leverage processes that augment neuroplasticity in a positive way, it is believed to have a beneficial effect on both cognitive health and mental health. On the flip side, impairments in neuroplasticity have been seen to be underlying processes in conditions ranging from dementia to mental health issues, especially depression. Key here is to understand, again, this point that I've already made, which is that while neuroplasticity as a term is generally viewed through the lens of a positive thing, it is not really a positive thing or a negative thing. It is actually just the process of brain change. So neuroplasticity can occur, which puts our brains into a place of generally worse health. And this is why I talk a lot about this concept of stuckness. Neuroplasticity can actually create more stuckness in our brains because it solidifies pathways that can be disadvantageous. It can also, however, be used to solidify pathways that are advantageous, or to rewrite certain pathways that we want to replace with healthier pathways. But as it relates to the less healthy neuroplasticity, I would just use as an example that adverse life events, specifically adverse childhood experiences or adverse childhood events, these are events that have been thought to correlate with negative long-term brain health through neuroplasticity. So psychological trauma may induce neuroplasticity issues, and long-term can create problems. All of this is to say that healthy directed neuroplasticity is key to good brain health. So with all of this background, let's now talk about what do we do with this information? How do we rewire our brains using this science of neuroplasticity to enhance focus, to enhance memory, to enhance mental health, and to enhance cognitive health right now, and to promote better cognitive health in the future? Because as I've noted, neuroplasticity deficits may be one of the drivers in conditions like dementia, including Alzheimer's dementia. Okay, the first point to understand when we talk about how to harness neuroplasticity for our benefit is to know that your brain is always changing. You can't opt out of this process. Right now, your brain is different than it was a day ago, and it'll be different in a day from now compared to where it is today. So the brain is always changing. We get to have the opportunity to direct that change for our benefit or to allow the modern world to direct our brains towards something that on average is not going to serve us. Let's talk about some of the key things that we can do to ensure that neuroplasticity works in a way that benefits us. The first thing that I love as it relates to neuroplasticity is just to understand that our brains are constantly searching for novelty. They are looking to learn. When we flex our brain muscle, which isn't quite right because the brain is mostly fat, but as an idea, when we flex our brain muscles, we are triggering neuroplasticity pathways. How do we do this? You can learn a new language, you can play an instrument, you can practice public speaking, you can engage in artistic pursuits. Novelty, though, and a bit of a challenge seems to be the key. So, traveling to a new country promotes neuroplasticity. Putting yourself in a situation like reading a poem on stage, which certainly is not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but these are things that promote neuroplasticity because they are novel and because they stretch our brains. So, here is the idea: is to number one, create novelty, healthy novelty in your life to promote neuroplasticity. Do something new, learn something new. If you're listening to this conversation, you're learning something new. So you're actively promoting healthy neuroplasticity right now. The second tip as to how to promote healthy neuroplasticity in your brain is going to be as simple as promoting movement. Of all the things that we know of that promote good brain function, that help to decrease risk of dementia, depression, help to promote good cognition, focus, attention right now, exercise remains at the top of the list. And one of the reasons is because physical activity seems to amp up and promote healthy neuroplasticity. How does this work? One central pathway is that exercise upregulates perhaps the best studied neuroplasticity promoting molecule called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And it's thought that when BDNF levels go down, it suppresses healthy neuroplasticity. When BDNF levels go up, it has the opposite effect. And exercise is the most potent upregulator of BDNF in humans that we know of. In addition, a point that is important to make is that stress and inflammation may actually suppress BDNF and, for a number of other reasons, can decrease healthy neuroplasticity. So it is notable that getting regular exercise can help to decrease inflammation in our bodies and in our brains. And exercise, if you do it the right way, so perhaps running an ultra marathon would not be a good example, but some level of exercise each day can actually help to have a leveling effect on stress pathways and therefore decrease the negative effects of stress on neuroplasticity. There's a lot to be said as far as how to actually exercise, but moving your body for roughly 20 to 30 minutes a day is a great tool for neuroplasticity. And it's not just about aerobic exercise. You don't have to get necessarily on a treadmill. That is a great exercise for many people, but lifting weights, resistance training also increases BDNF. It also helps to decrease inflammation. So any form of exercise, I would say, if you can, shoot for something like a moderate intensity exercise, is a wonderful way to support healthy neuroplasticity. The third point I would make is that chronic stress is toxic to healthy neuroplasticity. And I will couch this in saying, I can't tell you you should get rid of chronic stress. That would be ridiculous. And nobody's going to remove the effects of stress on their lives completely. But understand the following. Chronic stress seems to suppress BDNF signaling and may impair neuroplasticity, in particular in the hippocampus. That's the memory center of the brain that is preferentially affected in conditions like Alzheimer's disease. Chronic stress also seems to impact our glial cells, which again are these very important cells that work alongside our neurons to basically allow us to experience life. So stress is a major contributor to decreased healthy neuroplasticity. What do we do about this? There are many different strategies. Some of the most evidence-based strategies to combat chronic stress: meditation, time in nature, breath work, mindfulness, exercise, getting good sleep. Sometimes it's hard to get good sleep if you're very stressed. And what I'd say here is, if you're really struggling with stress, don't get all your information from the internet. This is where you should be seeking a professional to help you to find strategies that will work for you. So I highly recommend that if you are somebody who is really struggling with chronic stress. While mindfulness and meditation and nature exposure are amazing, you may benefit from additional support. The fourth point that I would make as it relates to, in particular, dietary interventions to support healthy neuroplasticity is to skip the highly processed food and to skip excessive alcohol consumption. These effects may be a little bit more subtle for certain dietary changes as opposed to some of the other things that I have described, but it has been shown that eating an ultra-processed diet contributes to a number of unhealthy brain changes, and some of these relate to neuroplasticity. We know that an unhealthy ultra-processed diet ramps up inflammation. Inflammation can damage neuroplasticity. We also know that if you make the opposing dietary choices, meaning eating a diet closer to, let's say, a minimally processed Mediterranean style diet rich in polyphenols, omega-3s, and fiber, these are choices that may support healthy neuroplasticity. So the point here being diet contributes to whether our brains are flexible, whether we can rewire them in a healthy way, and choosing a healthy diet is an amazing way to take a vote for healthy neuroplasticity. As it relates to alcohol, you may be seeing my other video or content on alcohol. There's a lot of debate over whether alcohol is something we should or should not be consuming, but I would say that alcohol use has been associated with a decrease in levels of BDNF and may support inflammation at higher levels. So anything at around the moderate to high levels of alcohol consumption, I do think is a risk factor for worse brain health. And if we're talking about pathway-specific issues here, realize that high levels of alcohol consumption promote inflammation, damage metabolic health, and can suppress BDNF. And as a little side note here, the amount to which a person feels hungover actually correlates with levels of inflammation. So one little surrogate here to say, hey, is this an amount of alcohol that should be considered as dangerous for my brain? If you are experiencing a hangover, that may be a marker that you are consuming enough to increase inflammation, and therefore you may have some of these side effects, including a decrease in healthy neuroplasticity. The last correlate here that I'd like to discuss as it relates to how to rewire your brain, how to promote healthy neuroplasticity, is going to be getting good sleep. Getting good sleep is linked to better focus, better cognition, better mood, better decision making. Basically, across the board, good sleep is an absolute game changer for brain health. And what we know about neuroplasticity, specifically how we can rewire our brain using good sleep, is that sleep appears to act on a number of neuroplasticity related pathways, and it appears to have kind of this global effect at stabilizing healthy neuroplasticity. Some of the pathways that are linked to neuroplasticity that sleep works on includes improving metabolic health, in part by cleaning out, using the glymphatic system, metabolic debris that builds up in the brain during the day, as well as having a normalizing effect on immune balance, specifically by decreasing chronic inflammation. Sleep deficit in the alternative scenario where we're not getting enough sleep is linked to decreases in BDNF. And there was a study that was just published in the Journal of Affective Disorders in June of 2024, where they looked at what happened in an animal model, and they found that sleep deprivation was linked to drop-offs in neuroplasticity. But the great news from this animal study is that sleep recovery led to a powerful and rapid rebound in neuroplasticity-related metrics. So what that says is, again, generalizing from this animal data, sleep deficit can damage healthy neuroplasticity, but getting good sleep, getting a recovery of good sleep, they actually dramatically enhance some of those neuroplasticity-related metrics. The key takeaway here would be to prioritize 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep each night for most people. And I know some of you are out there saying, I only need 5 hours of sleep. I would say, statistically speaking, you're probably not accurate if you're talking about optimizing your brain health. And so if you are somebody who struggles with your sleep, I have a ton of content on this topic in particular, but similarly to what I was discussing as it relates to chronic stress, if you're really struggling with your sleep, if you spend your entire day feeling exceptionally tired, if you've been told that you snore, if you've been told that you stop breathing in the night, consider talking to your healthcare practitioner about a sleep evaluation. Sleep apnea and other sleep-related disorders are incredibly common. They are treatable, and they can dramatically improve your quality of sleep. One last consideration before we close out here. We've talked primarily about lifestyle modification and how these things can influence neuroplasticity, but there's a lot of fascinating work being done on how pharmaceuticals may have their effect through neuroplasticity. So in particular, SSRIs or antidepressant medications have been proposed for years to work through serotonin and other neurotransmitter-related pathways. We're now seeing that the serotonin hypothesis of depression is not so solid, and it may be the case that SSRIs and related molecules primarily work in the people they work for through neuroplasticity. Perhaps even more interesting is as we look at molecules like psychedelics, research reveals that they may act by augmenting neuroplasticity and acting on a number of different neuroplastic pathways, BDNF as well as others, to ramp up healthy neuroplasticity in our brain. With all of this said, there is still so much more that we could discuss as it relates to what is happening in neuroplasticity and how different actions, how different types of interventions act on different neuroplasticity-related pathways. Everything from cognitive behavioral therapy to, as I said, psychedelics, certain foods. But the cornerstone of this conversation and the takeaway point that I'd really love for you to bring home is to understand that you can change your brain. Actually, you don't have an option. Your brain is changing, will continue to change. You get the opportunity to change that brain for your benefit. How do you do that? You give it the inputs that are associated with better brain health. So you consume things that are going to help to open up these pathways of reprogramming. You do things that open up these pathways of reprogramming, and you direct your brain towards things that are going to allow it to rewire itself for the better. So better relationships, consuming better content from the news and from the internet, engaging in relationships with nature and with yourself. These things, in addition to helping to open up these neuroplastic pathways, will help to ensure that you are actually moving your brain wiring towards something more beneficial. Thank you so much for joining me. As I've said, I am Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and I am fully focused on bringing you tools and tactics to enhance your brain health. If you're interested to learn more, please consider subscribing and following along, and I'll see you for the next video. Thanks for watching.